Well, I had visions of having talking about the wood used in ships and the wood discovered in colonies, and then the wood. It was this wonderful concept, and the more I got into it, the bigger it became. So this is going to be like the tip of the iceberg. All kinds of woods belongs to the building of ships or other works that have a relation to timber. We do and shall find in a little time a great want of, for wood is now utterly decayed in England and begins to be no less so in Ireland. If money or wealth decay in the kingdom, there may be ways of trade to recover it. If sailors die, as long as there are ships in navigation, they will soon increase and make their deaths forgotten. But if our timber be consumed and spent, it will require the age of 2 or 3 or 4 generations before it can grow again for use. So said William Monson, who died in 1643. He was now the first to voice this concern over the state of what we as Americans would call forests. There had been similar statements back into the 16th century. Monson and others were specifically speaking about timber for the Royal Navy, which in 1600 numbered about 75 ships. This would increase until by 1800 there were over 330 ships in the Royal Navy. I've used the Royal Navy's use of timber because it's well documented and allows us to extrapolate to a degree to the overall use of timber in England and show why importation of timber became necessary. The Navy used mostly oak for the hulls and frames of their ships. Below the waterline, elm was often used for the keel and beech for the garbage trays and ceiling planking. Ash was used for blocks and pine or spruce for masts and spars. England had vast stands of oak, some in royal reserves, but much more on great estates owned by the lesser nobility and landed gentry. Frequently, during the 2.5 centuries, from 1600 to the advent of iron ships in 1860, plans and legislation were proposed for planting and harvesting, which would allow a continuous and reliable source of wood for the Navy. But as they say, there's many a slip, which the cup and the lip. These conservation measures were acted upon only sporadically, stymied by personal interest of the landowners and by Parliament, many of whom had large forest holdings as well. It took 18 to 120 years for an oak tree to reach the 15 to 18 inches diameter needed for the beams and planking, which was 4 to 8 inches thick in a warship. These were early on readily available. The practice of coppicing, where the stumps were allowed to sprout, and the shoots harvested after 20 years is closed. So then they would harvest these stumps for firewood and for tan bark. But what it did, it allowed income from the land and allowed the mature trees to grow. So it was like a 2-story system. You had the maturing trees that were tall, and then you had the coppice trees as an understory. And they would leave about 50 of these trees to mature. And they yielded straight timber useful for planking and beams, but not the curved buttocks and knees. These were harvested from hedgerow trees, which grew singly and had large curved branches and crotches. Some growth could be controlled by tying young branches into the needed curves, but this required decades of forethought. Shipwrights would cruise the woods with patterns to identify trees with the right formations for the needed components. The tree would be chopped down, all they used were axes, and the desired pieces sawn on site and then transported to the shipyard. Much harder to find were what were called the great timbers and the compass timbers. These were parts of the ship that had to be one solid piece, such as the stern post. On a first-rate ship of the line, the stern post was 40 feet long and 28 inches thick. Compass timbers were used for the deeply curved sides of the ship, which at that time were designed with a fairly extreme tumble home, so they bulged out like at the second or third deck, and then the weather deck was much narrower. These connected, let's see, especially hard to find was wood for the wing transom knees, which were V-shaped timbers with legs up to 14 feet long and proportionately thick. These connected the stern post to the aftermost frame on either side. This is kind of like a wishbone. So they would be horizontal. Transporting these pieces from the stump to the shipyard must have been quite a challenge. Often the construction of a ship had to be halted for months or even years for want of one of these great timbers or compass timbers. One of the problems with finding great timbers was the risk of center rot as the tree grew past maturity. Often one of these huge old trees would be cut and found to be hollow and worth nothing but firewood. So landowners were loath to have the trees grow past maturity by another generation or two and risk losing the value of that investment. So how much oak was being used by the Navy? A ship of the line, a 1,000-ton burden, used 4,000 to 6,000 trees, or about 100 acres of forest. If we assume the average English warship of 1,600 was 300 tons burden, which is, the Mary Rose was 400, between 400 and 500. And so that's a reasonable assumption, I think. If we assume that a ship in 1,600 used just a third of the oak needed as a first rate, the 75 ships in 1,600 would have required 100,000 to 150,000 trees. And remember, the Navy wasn't the only consumer of timber. The merchant marine used about 3 times the amount as the Navy. Oak was also used for barrels, wagons, houses, furniture, firewood, and charcoal for smelting iron and for glassworks. Although smelting with coal was attempted in the 17th century, it wasn't until the middle of the 18th century that smelting with coke became commercially viable. By the end of the 18th century, charcoal was still being used to smelt about 30% of the iron. An untold amount of oak must have been burned to make charcoal. The Navy went into crisis mode for their timber supplies several times during these 200 years. And the first big problem was the middle of the 17th century, was the Great Fire of London, which coincided pretty much with the First Dutch War. So the Great Fire of London burned most of London down. And although stone and brick were required for the rebuild, there was still a lot of wood that was needed for the interior work and the roofs. The first colonized, we're getting to the colonized countries now. The first colonized country that was exploited for ship timber was Ireland, starting in 1603. There were large oak forests there, but the rivers, by and large, were too small, and the roads were practically non-existent to transport large timbers. 20 miles from navigable water was the limit for economically moving timbers or logs overland. Consequently, few large ships were built in Ireland, and the amount of oak exported to England for this purpose was negligible. Much of the great oak forest in Ireland was used instead to make barrel staves, tens of millions of barrel staves. Barrels were used to store and transport everything from cheese to gunpowder. I got into a little math with this and actually had to ask for Jim Nelson's help. To provision a ship of the line with a crew of 800 men for 6 months' cruise took 624 barrels of meat, 416 barrels of flour, 23 barrels of peas, 39 barrels of oatmeal, 13 barrels of cheese and butter, 1,040 barrels of water, 1,500 barrels of ship biscuits, and 2,880 barrels of beer. It was small beer, but there was a lot of it. The ration for beer was a gallon a day per man. Oh, the barrels, the barrels were 50 gallons. Don't ask me if it's imperial or American, probably imperial. And by weight, they were 200 pounds, depending on what was in them. Oh, there'd be an additional 750 special barrels. What made them special was there was no iron. They were banded with either copper or wood, so they wouldn't spark. 750 barrels of gunpowder. That's a total of 7,285 barrels for the ship, which would be a total of around 2 million barrels to provide for the fleet per year. And the barrels were consumables. You know, it was empty. You threw it overboard so there'd be more room for the men. It must have been some crowded. As in the case of the ship timber, the private need for barrels exceeded that of the Navy. Now, the Navy had great esteem for English oak, especially that harvested in Suffolk. They were oak snobs. However, the lack of a coherent timber policy forced them to import timber from other sources. The Baltic region had for years been the source for mast and spars, tacks, tar, flax, and hemp. Flax was needed to make sail canvas and hemp for the ropes. And it's estimated that the number of conifers cut and distilled to make tar exceeded the number of trees used to manufacture the boat. Further, it has been said that the value of the rigging and sails exceeded the value of the hull. So imagine the labor in spinning and weaving all that flax. There were well-established suppliers of ship timbers and ship stores in ports around the Baltic Sea, but these sources were vulnerable to international conflict. In particular, closing the Sound, which is the passage between Sweden and the tip of Denmark, could shut off England's access to these vital supplies. Consequently, England would ally with either Sweden or Denmark, whichever one was weaker, as the occasion demanded. Sometimes more than once a year, they'd switch sides to keep the Sound open. Elizabethan explorers hoped to find wealth from gold, but they were aware of the needs of the English shipbuilding, and this is, 50, 75 years before Popham. If we may enjoy a large territory of apt soil, we might so use the matter as we would not depend on Eastland, meaning the Baltic region, for flax, pitch, tar, mast, etc. Humphrey Gilbert, Walter Raleigh, John Smith, and other early explorers made similar observations. Timber shipments began soon after the colonies were established in New England, or as we know from Popham, even before. Following the attempted shipment from Popham in 1608, 80 masts were exported from Virginia in 1609. 1623 saw a load of clapboards exported from Plymouth, and in 1634, the first shipments of masts from New England. The Navy realized that to efficiently export masts from New England to Old England, there had to be an established lumber trade. And they therefore encouraged lumbering in general, even though they had no use for most of the timber that was harvested. But it was decades after colonization before a timber trade was established, due to two factors. The cost of transport was much higher than it was from the Baltic. And secondly, the effects of transport, especially on oak, severely compromised the quality of the timber. Logs were floated down rivers to the ports, such as Portland or Falmouth, now known as Portland or Portsmouth. and arrived soaking wet, where they were loaded onto the ship's hold, where with no ventilation, fungus was well established before it could be unloaded in England. This gave American oak a bad reputation. In addition, the Navy was frequently using oak for new construction and for repairs before it could be seasoned. Ideally, they would season the logs for 3 years before they used them. And they tried to keep a store 3 years worth of logs ahead. And only a couple times in 200 years they managed to pull it off. The case for masts was different. England had been importing masts from Scandinavia from the time of Henry VIII. England had no good mast trees. In times of crisis, the Navy would grudgingly use Scottish fir, but used mast wood and oak from the Baltic region. Thereafter, English masts were attained. I must have skipped a page. I must have dropped a paragraph. The paragraph I dropped was telling about the importation of masts from New England started then until 1776, when for some reason the supply was cut off. And then they decided to start importing masts from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, and oak from Vermont, not directly. It went from Vermont, was smuggled into Canada, and then exported. So those Vermont Yankees, you know. The mainmast for a first-rate ship was 40 inches in diameter and 40 feet long. Well, 40 yards long, excuse me. They were hewn in New England and shipped 16-sided. Prior to the importing of American masts, the Baltic region couldn't supply these large diameter trees. So the English devised masts that were pieced together from smaller timbers, Baltic spruce and fir. During the 120 years they relied on the giant pines from New England, that skill was lost and had to be reinvented during the American Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars until the trade with Nova Scotia was developed. There were plentiful stands of live oak, perfectly suited for the shipbuilding practices of the day, and southern yellow pine, which could be superior to our white pine for masts. These resources weren't utilized because the colonists in the southern regions were not interested in developing a timber trade. They had tobacco. Eventually, the English started importing southern pine and made entire ships from this wood. They were faster to build, but had a short service life of 7 to 10 years. The oak ships, in theory, would go 30 to 50 years, but the average was 12 because of including this wood that was prone to dry rot because of foreshipping or whatever. In the War of 1812, the pine-built Levant and the Cayenne were shattered by the Constitution, built with southern live oak, in the last battle of her career. That was February 10, 1815, about a month and a half after the war was over. But news hadn't reached the boat yet. It eventually became obvious that the dwindling supply of oak would require investigating possible replacement species. The government of Portugal, which England had helped transport the royals from Portugal to Brazil, and in gratitude, they offered wood from the Amazon region, but there was no organized timber trade and transportation was expensive. The English made some use of mahogany, as did the Spanish, but good timber was expensive and the poorer grades were so porous as to be useless. In 1811, an attempt was made to import wood from South Africa. Officers based in Cape Town reported of an inexhaustible supply of ship timber along the Kooribong River, not far from Cape Town, which the Dutch had used for many years. There were 2 kinds of wood found to be suitable, stinkwood, which was a sort of oak, for hull planking and beams, but lacking the curvature needed for compass timber, and yellowwood for masts and spars. There were the usual problems of harvesting and transport back to England and other issues dealing with the boars and scalping rental of wagons and stuff like that. Nevertheless, they were able to ship several cargoes back to England. The shipwrights found that the stinkwood was prone to cracking when sawn into planks, but was valuable in other parts of construction. The yellow wood was gradually accepted for use in masts and spars. The Navy even imported a dozen samples of different wood from Sierra Leone and conducted tests in 1813. African teak was deemed suitable and was regularly imported from 1815 until the end of the era of wooden warships. They also found some suitable woods, jarrah and kauri in Australia and New Zealand, but the shipping cost was prohibitive, except in the case of returning convict transports, which otherwise would have been returning home empty. Teak from India was superior to oak in many ways. Impervious to marine borers, it could be bent and shaped like oak, and importantly, it didn't corrode iron fastenings. That meant ships could be nailed, bolted, or riveted rather than fastened with trunnels, which speeded production. It also made it possible to replace grown knees with iron knees, that's GROWN. Several English warships of teak were built in Bombay, now Mumbai, by a skilled Parsi shipwright, Janjetji Jijiboy. I had to put that in there. And he evidently was quite an inventive man and made many improvements when he was building these English warships. Teak was then imported from India by means of loading cut timbers onto newly built ships who were returning for outfitting, basically a kit. So they build one ship and they put another ship in pieces on it and send them. It's kind of cool. So we have the English, because of their wantonly bad management of their own oak, searching the world for replacement species. Now we won't get into the musical part. Before the 16th century, European instrument builders were limited to local varieties of wood, with a few exotics imported from Africa. In museums in Europe, they have pipes made from African blackwood, and there's even a lute and a theobro in one museum that are made of elephant ivory, the whole thing. Yeah, imagine. Common was used for flutes, crumhorns, curtils, which are the forerunner of the bassoon, and recorders were maple, boxwood, and various fruit woods like pear, apple, plum. Bagpipes were made from boxwood or African blackwood. A few, and I mentioned the elephant ivory. Stringed instruments such as lutes, guitars, sitoles, and fiddles were generally made of maple with spruce soundboards. Harps could be made of maple, oak, bog willow, and bog willow is willow that has been buried in a peat bog and almost fossilized. And it's amazing stuff. Sometimes yew, which has the advantage that worms won't touch it. So. Colonization made a host of new words available for many purposes. Portugal imported huge numbers of what was termed Brazil wood from Brazil, in fact, giving Brazil its name. Brazil wood was actually a number, about 15 different species of rosewood lumped together. This wood was imported to be ground into powder to make red dye for cloth. Cabinet makers in Europe were soon using rosewood on high-end furniture for its beauty. Instrument makers discovered that in addition to its aesthetic appeal, rosewood was acoustically superior to traditional European wood for many instruments. Rosewood, so called because of the floral aroma when it's being cut, and cocobolo make excellent woodwinds. True Brazilian rosewood, which is Dalbergia nigra, is renowned for its tonal excellence and was used in the finest Spanish guitars from its early adoption in the 16th century until today. However, over the last 500 years, Brazilian rosewood has been harvested to near extinction. It's been illegal to trade rosewood internationally since 1992, when it was added to the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, or CITES, list. Brazilian rosewood remains in only 5% of its original range and is subject to illegal harvesting and export, surpassing the value of elephant ivory on the black market. Similarly, Pernambuco, another member of the rosewood family, was found to be the best wood for violin bows. Stradivari may have made Pernambuco bows in the 17th century, and most bows since Troche formalized the design of the modern bow in the 1780s are made from this wood. Pernambuco is also on the CITES list. Bowmakers attempted unsuccessfully to do an end run around the regulations by financing the planting of Pernambuco trees in coffee plantations. Coffee has to grow in the shade. To offset the demands of the worldwide bowmakers, which requires about 1 tree a year. With Brazilian rosewood difficult to obtain since the 1960s and legally unavailable since 1992, guitar makers in particular have been using other woods for the back and sides of guitars. East Indian rosewood from India and Madagascar were available until 2017, when all Dalbergia species were listed in the CITES. Currently, there are dozens of tropical species being used in the building of guitars, joining the more common use of maple, mahogany, and walnut. Another species under pressure is ebony. Ebony from Madagascar is on the CITES list. Ebony in India and Sri Lanka have been heavily logged and are under pressure. However, African ivory, ebony, is still available, especially in Cameroon. Bob Taylor, who founded Taylor Guitars, bought a sawmill in Cameroon in 2011 specifically to mill ebony for guitars. He founded the Ebony Project that is planting ebony and other fruiting trees in the region. He's also, and this is really cool, he's also changing the accepted aesthetic of ebony. He found that the African loggers were rejecting 90 to 95% of the trees they cut because they were not jet black, but had brown streaks. The Taylor Company now uses this streaked wood on their guitars for fingerboards and bridges, and in my opinion, it's much more interesting. In addition to the exotic woods being used today, some builders are using North American woods. Cherry and sassafras have been used to make CITES-safe guitars and harps. And by CITES-safe, I mean you can cross the international border and come back, and they won't take your instrument away from you and destroy it. So if you've got, an ivory nut on your saddle or an ivory frog on your violin bow, you have to make sure that it's registered, and even then, it's no guarantee. Locust has been used. Being the hardest of large North American trees, it can be difficult to plane and bend, and I know that from personal experience, but so are many of the tropical woods. The initial search, I'm going to wind it up now. The initial search for ship timber was undertaken under duress to find woods that could serve a specific purpose. That limited the varieties that were useful and also led to bad outcomes when bad shipping practices and short schedules compromised the quality of imported timber. Instrument makers didn't go looking for new woods, but availed themselves of wood already being imported for other purposes. In our time, these woods that have been traditionally used in instrument building have become scarce, even endangered. So instrument makers are now experimenting with many different woods in their work, much like the Royal Navy of 1813. It is to be hoped that conservation measures currently in place will allow the renewed use of rosewood and ebony when some of their former ranges are restored and the trees mature 100 years from now. Thank you.